Everything in Russia has recently been turned upside down, and the aggressive invasion of Ukraine is being labeled as Russia's defense against NATO. So, and it would be strange if it were otherwise, the Church has become one of the main ideological forces behind the war.
Ну и поскольку вы возглавляете, Владимир Васильевич, Росгвардию, то я хотел бы, чтобы этот образ именно был в рядах Росгвардии Российской Федерации.
Ваше Святейшество, благодарю вас за этот дар. Хочу пожелать вам многие лета во славу трудов ваших. И хочу довести до вас и до всех присутствующих здесь прихожан о том, что войска Национальной гвардии совместно с вооруженными силами Российской Федерации выполняют все поставленные задачи в ходе этой военной контроперации.
This video is from March 14th, 3 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, presents an icon to the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov. Zolotov's troops are in the town of Bucha, near Kiev at the time, where later hundreds of civilians were found murdered. Patriarch Kirill does not question the war. He doesn't call for peace. He uses the same words as Vladimir Putin when he justifies aggression against Ukraine.
Сегодня тема, связанная с российско-украинскими отношениями, стала частью большой, или, как говорят теперь, геополитики. И одной из целей этой геополитики является ослабление России, которая стала сильной, реально могучей страной.
The Russian Church has always been close to and cozied up to the state. And the state in Russia has always wanted the Church to be under its control. In the time of the Russian Empire, the Church was actually part of the state itself. In the Soviet Union, religion was forbidden and security services controlled the churches that continued to operate. Finally, in the 90s, the new Russian constitution stipulated that the church was separate entirely from the state, but the reality was completely different. According to official surveys, about 60% of Russians consider themselves Orthodox Christians. Even if one assumes that this figure is exaggerated, it still amounts to tens of millions of people that the Kremlin can influence through religion. In return, the church receives considerable financial support from the state.
Нельзя изучать историю России, не зная истории церкви. Ведь кто были такие патриархи? Рядом с царем всегда сидели царь и патриарх. История России, государства, история церкви настолько были тесно переплетены, что разорвать невозможно. А сейчас в учебном процессе разорвано.
Vladimir Putin carries himself like a Russian Tsar, and the church, led by Patriarch Kirill, is like a part of his kingdom. The Russian Orthodox Church supports all of the government's repressive and most scandalous initiatives, such as the ban on adoptions of Russian Orphans by Americans and anti-LGBT laws. Kirill Gavarun, a prominent theologian, believes that the church and state in Russia became especially close after Pussy Riot's famous protest in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. At the time, the state sided with the church and sentenced the protesters who had burst into and gave an impromptu performance loaded with political statements to 2 years in prison.
For example, the Russian Church joined in the persecution of the famous group Pussy Riot. When the Russian Church did not support the protests in Bolotnaya Square and definitively took the side of the government, it was probably then that this fusion process began to take place, following the worst traditions of the Byzantine Empire.
I remember well when Metropolitan Ilarion, one of the leaders of the church, came on the air at TV Rain after the Pussy Riot protest and said that the church would not ask for mercy for the participants. I was not surprised at the time, but I could not imagine that 10 years later the Russian church would support the war. But even 2 years ago, it did not seem like such an impossible event. 2 years ago, the Patriarch inaugurated the Church of the Armed Forces, which, among other things, had a mural depicting Vladimir Putin as if the Russian president were no longer only a Tsar, but also a saint. And now several priests are officially blessing the Russian army before seeing them off to war. Some priests even teach people how to fire an RPG.
Московская духовная академия семинария сражается с НАТО. Христос воскресе!
And some are fighting in Ukraine themselves and dying there. One of them is priest Mikhail Vasilyev, rector of a church in one of the military garrisons. In his last interview, he urged women to give birth to more children so that it is less difficult to send their current children away to war.
Ну, я понимаю прекрасно, что каждой даме от природы Господь в большинстве случаев попустил родить множество деток. Если дама, исполняя эту заповедь Божию, плодитесь и размножайтесь, отказалась от, соответственно, искусственных средств прерывания беременности в самом широком спектре, то, очевидно, ребеночек у нее будет не один, а больше, в большинстве случаев. А значит, ей не так больно и страшно будет, соответственно, с ним расставаться, пусть даже на время.
Mikhail Vasilyev was killed during a battle not far from the city of Kherson. On Wednesday, Patriarch Kirill personally conducted his funeral ceremony. That circle has clues. Although the main virtue of Orthodoxy is peacefulness, this does not stop the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church from supporting the invasion of Ukraine. Otherwise, it would lose the support of the state. In choosing between the Kremlin and the principles of Orthodoxy, the church leadership has chosen the Kremlin. However, one should not assume that there aren't those in the Russian Orthodox Church who do not support the war. In fact, there are, and there are many of them.
Я считаю войну против Украины преступлением и великим позором. Позором, который сделал нашу страну изгоем на мировой арене, с которой не хотят считаться и не доверяют уже словам наших правителей.
But expressing an anti-war stance in the church in Russia today is just as unsafe as it is in secular life. Despite this, nearly 300 priests wrote an open letter speaking against the war. The leadership condemned this appeal and claimed that the priests were unnecessarily engaging in politics, as if it was them sitting next to Putin, not Patriarch Kirill. But of course, they weren't being unduly political. They were doing what priests should be doing during a war of aggression, calling on the authorities to come to their senses and stop the bloodshed.